Well, that's a different way to start a conference, isn't it? But this is a different conference. This is we thought, well, it would be a nice way. And of course, with due reference, I think, to our Aboriginal heritage, and that is the only fitting way to start a conference is actually kind of landing ourselves in the room in the ways that people have done that in ceremony and meeting in this country for at least 60,000 years. So right up front, we acknowledge elders past and present, particularly for any Aboriginal or Indigenous people in this room, but for all of you. And one of the things I love about the fact that this has pervaded all of our functions and conferences now is that it's a really nice thing to do, and I like to dwell on it so it doesn't feel just like an air hostessy up the front of the plane reminding you where your jacket is if it all goes wrong. No, this is a chance to actually stop and acknowledge, bring ourselves into the space, and remind ourselves that we all stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. So, whatever's brought you here, whatever people, whatever ancestors and knowledge have brought you into this room now, we pause for a minute to acknowledge that. And I think it also reminds us that we become somebody's ancestor one day, and that's a bit of a burden, isn't it, really, if you actually take some thought into that? Particularly if you're a landholder. How many people in the room are owning, controlling, running pieces of land? Can we have that? Oh my God, that's a good result. Thank you so much for being here. That's just fabulous. You know, at Little Greening Bathurst, you know, we're a group of volunteers, basically an urban-based group, but, you know, Bathurst Council expanded from the urban area to the regions a while ago now, and we thought, well, that's good. And so, you know, council really needs to take some stewardship over what happens more broadly, and so should we as the group of Greening Bathurst. So we started getting more into, I guess, talking about and thinking about the sorts of things that align with our ideology, which is closely aligned to, you know, taking a longer term view of things. And so I acknowledge you guys all for turning up and sharing that with us. And I think particularly David Goldie and some of the team, we've got a fantastic group of speakers for you. Now, our first speaker for the day, we'll get straight into, is Charles Massey. I won't spend too much time talking about what he's done, but he's a man of practice. He has been a farmer and is a farmer, and also gone to uni and done a PhD. So that's had him uniquely placed, I think, to talk about agriculture as he sees it. So without further ado, can you please welcome to the stage Dr. Charles Massey.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Can you all hear that? Okay. And thanks to the organisers for today. Thanks for everyone for coming. I know David Goldney, John Fry and many others have put a lot of work into this, and this is a testament. Those of us speaking know that there is a shift on, and I think this encapsulates that. Ashley, particular thanks for your welcome to country. It's great when someone with an Indigenous background does that, because I think we have a lot to learn from that 65,000 odd years of landscape management, and I think most of us in this room are working towards regenerating country. So my job today is to set the context for the day, because what the organisers have lined up is some of the leaders of regenerative agriculture in Australia, who some of us have written about, but there's others that are the quiet achievers who've been doing it for decades, who have got a chance to talk. And whilst we're a disruptive, as you can see from the title slide, a disruptive movement, which is what all new innovations are, and we don't necessarily have the scientific and political establishment on side, We are fortunate to have a number of lead scientists and analysts also talking today who are working with us. So I'm the wrong date of birth for some of this, so we'll see how we go. Is that working? Okay, so my message is pretty simple. From healthy landscapes, healthy food and fibre is derived, and as I'm going to discuss, healthy profits, people and a healthy planet. Sounds a big claim, but I'm very excited about what's emerging. Regenerative agriculture, as you can see, if you can see the slides, some of it's very old, some of it's very new. It's all working on regenerating the key landscape functions, starting with things like regenerating the soil, etc. So when I'm talking about regenerative ag, it covers a whole spectrum from grazing, agroforestry, biological cropping, the old versions of biodynamics, etc., etc. What I'd like to do first, though, is deal with the big challenges in front of us and how regenerative agriculture can address these. And I believe this is the big one. Our planet's now moved into a new phase called the Anthropocene. So on the left you can see a blue-green planet. It's the only one in the solar system and what we know even further out. And what's intriguing about that is that it was life itself that created conditions for life. That's why it's blue-green. About 3.2 billion years ago, bacteria first put oxygen up into the atmosphere. And then once algae and lichens, fungi got going over 400 million years ago and started to make soil from rocks, that led to the great forests, and the carbon dioxide cycle started to be regulated. So it's life that's responsible for that blue-green planet. And now we've got one species that's starting to destabilise it. Now we're hearing a lot about climate, but there's actually 9 integrated Earth systems that in a self-organising way maintain the conditions for life, that we've had the last 10 or 12,000 years, a precious period. What's now happened through industrial capitalism and what we're doing to the planet is now pushing it out of those safe boundaries, and that's why it's called the Anthropocene, human-made. And you can see there, well, you possibly can't read the writing, but that's the 9 Earth systems. Some of them already, 3 of them have already gone across the safe boundaries into unknown dangerous territory. I personally believe this Anthropocene challenge makes world wars look like storms in teacups. It's the greatest thing that's ever confronted our species. And as I'll get to later, we have solutions for it better than anyone else in regenerative ag. And that's because the evidence, if you look at more and more evidence, it's industrial agriculture that is one of the key players, if not the worst player, in destabilising all those Earth systems. But there's a converse to that. If industrial agriculture is a great destabiliser, as I'll discuss later, regenerative agriculture can be the number one way of turning that around, and that's incredibly exciting. So let's look at the first of the issues of the problems, agriculture, and I've deliberately inserted a hyphen in that word because it's, as one farmer said, this square foot of real estate between our ears is what determines how we farm and how we treat the landscape. And we're farming in a continent that's totally different to where our Western agriculture came from. Up to 3.8 billion years old, 2/3 of our continent. So the nutrients are incredibly eroded in minute quantities. So our ecologies have evolved over millions of years extraordinary means of recycling those scarce nutrients. Underneath this ancient landscape, because of that history, is a lot of salt. We don't have aerosols coming off nearby ocean, deep ocean currents like other continents. We don't have a Mississippi River, big mountain chains in the middle creating more nutrients. And so what happened with Australia was that when the first white settlers came from moist, humid northwest Europe, they came from a land that was, if you like, 10,000 years young, post-glacial, chock full of nutrients after the Ice Age and the glaciers melted, and humid atmosphere, humid soils. And they brought agricultural techniques, evolved for that, to this totally different continent. You clear the trees in the wrong places, within 3 or 4 decades you get dry land salinity. And you overgraze, overclear, you get similar collapses. I talk in my book, it took only 15 years for the first settlers into Western Victoria to turn a hydrated, soft, spongy landscape into a landscape of 20-foot deep gullies, rising salt and trees falling into those gullies. New England dieback, eucalypt dieback, took 130 years. So whether it's 30 or 40 like salt, 15 in the grassland or 130, you progressively pull out the strands of a complex functioning ecosystem. It'll eventually go on you. And that was because of the knowledge and the techniques that came out of Western Europe, but also the mind that came. And that mind is what you call a mechanical mind. The indigenous mind, or there's a photo there of medieval peasants by a Bruegel painting. Their mind was what you'd call organic. They still saw themselves as an integral part of Mother Earth. Whatever you did to Earth, you did to yourself. By the time we went through the Renaissance, all that wonderful period of Western civilization, Renaissance, scientific revolution, industrial, capitalist evolution, our mind had shifted to the state where you could call it a mechanical mind. We now began to see the landscape as a mechanical type object from which we could extract nutrients, etc., for profit. We no longer saw ourselves as indivisible with Mother Earth. And that was the mind that came to Australia. And the consequences were the damage that resulted. And one of these consequences is the virtual destruction across our entire continent of the small water cycle. You don't hear much about the small water cycle. The mists and fogs from a hydrated landscape, transpiration from the plants, putting in microparticles that form the rain, etc. That's all gone. Those spongy grasslands, when you see in Sice Creeks, Peter Andrews is here today, he could talk all day on how we've destroyed the hydrated landscape we had. And we need to take note of it because there's some powerful historical lessons. If you look where the Western agriculture we've got evolved, it was in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent. Syria, Iraq, round to Libya. And then if you look at what's happened, and originally when domestication of agriculture began 10,000 years ago, they were beautifully rich, healthy landscapes. River valleys chock full of soil, healthy forests, and healthy grasslands. And here we have 360 BC. Plato is complaining about the destruction of the forests around the Mediterranean, in this case the Athens Hills, where he's saying the hills around there are like the skeleton of a sick man, all the fat and soft earth having been wasted away, which is a pretty good description of what's happened in Australia. The point I want to make, after 10,000 years, if you look at where our agriculture evolved, Syria, Iraq, Libya, the Saharan lands and that great belt of the Sahel, Chad, they're all now deserts. They're all in constant drought and there's major social trouble. And what I want to put out to you today, for all my travels across Australian landscapes, is that to varying degrees we are on the path of desertifying the Australian landscape. Some bad, and some in the process. And I think that's the challenge before us, which we need to confront. We have to stop this historical process that traditional Western agriculture delivers. If you can see these photos, that's sort of indicative in Sice gullies and stuff that were never here in 1788, etc., etc. A dramatic example I've heard about recently, having just flown back from Perth a few weeks ago and crossed the rabbit-proof fence. When the Western Australian government started to develop the croplands and encourage people to clear the mallee, that country on the right, the western side of the rabbit-proof fence, which was all mallee, they were able to clear and they were encouraged to do so. But I think the rainfall ISO height that they determined was about 14 inches. Someone might know better. That's the country to the left. That's still uncleared. So the country on the right of that photo was wetter than the country on the left. Today, if you go a few kilometres either side of that fence, that's reversed. You're now going to find a higher rainfall where the vegetation's chucking up material than on the right where you've got a lot less vegetation and giant heat domes hanging around through the endless summers there. Historical lessons there. So the question I'm asking is, how come our fossil capitalism has destroyed local food cultures, rural societies and landscapes and our planet? And it's that mechanical mind is the answer. And the lunacy of endless growth and economic rationalism. So I'm not going to get into that too much. Or I could get rotten tomatoes thrown as well. But the other negative I want to talk about, before I get onto all the positives, is the parallel rise in human ill health, along with the rise of industrial agriculture. You could say the rise of the Anthropocene through what we've done to it is in parallel and joined to the rising examples of ill health. The two are joined at the hip, so to speak. Our commodification of a food system, industrial agriculture and economic rationalism, etc. And why? Because when we co-evolved for about 1 million years in the savannas of Africa, whether it was women hunter-gatherers who can identify over 400 or 500 species of food and medicinal plants, or the hunters going off to get meat. And it wasn't just meat they were getting. Those animals they were hunting had been browsing shrub landscapes with tens of thousands of micronutrients in them. So we're co-evolved, receptors in our alimentary canal, our organs, our gut, feeding to the brain for a wide range of nutrients, micronutrients, phytochemicals, that are integral to our physiological and immune function. And what we've done now by stripping those nutrients from our food is really leading to a lot less healthy functioning immune and physiological system. And what industrial agriculture, the worst aspects of it is doing, is destroying the food nutrient availability, diversity and quality, and it delivers also, as I'll discuss in a minute, with glyphosate or Roundup. It's also delivering that into our industrial foods with some devastating effects that's emerging. So you could say that's a new view of human evolution. If it wasn't so serious, it's funny. And the milkshake container, you could almost put an MC on it. You probably can't see that, but there's a lot of now scientific evidence that's emerging. And this particular slide is from a study of 63 wheat cultivars, the soft whites, the bred wheats. So we've bred wheat plants to be dwarfed, responsive to inputs, fertilisers, irrigation. They've lost their adaptability, their natural efficiency. Yields have gone up, but we're now finding in these sorts of research that nutrients are crashing. And a lot of the key nutrients to physiological and immune function, your seleniums, your manganese, magnesiums, irons, etc., etc. And it's happening right across the board with industrial products, whether it's fruit or vegetables. Plenty of research that the nutrients are crashing as we breed for cosmetics and response to production, maximum production. You've only got to taste heritage mulberries from 100 years ago to the modern industrial crap, and the intense taste of the old mulberries is a measurement of the variety of nutrients versus those that are nearly empty. And Hippocrates, who gave us the medical ethics nearly 2,500 years ago, had this to say: "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." It's a very profound statement. And just to finish on the problem side, before I get to the good news, the elephant in the room. You've all been reading in The Land and elsewhere the emerging evidence that's now starting to pile in on glyphosate or Roundup. It's been suppressed for a long while. It's been cover-ups. I've worked with two of the lead scientists who enormously published over 20 years, and it is quite a frightening development. And so we're talking about the world's most widely used herbicide. It's not the worst, but it's the most widely used. There's nearly 1 million tonnes going out. And I think it's a massive vulnerability for our collective reputations as farmers. There's been some outstanding soil scientists for a long while. Professor Don Huber, widely respected right across the board, been working since the 70s with an intuitive worry about glyphosate. Robert Kramer used to be with the US Department of Agriculture, obviously not there anymore, and they've now catalogued, amongst many other scientists, the damaging impact on the soil of what glyphosate's doing, soil health, making availability of toxins, etc., making plants more vulnerable to disease and so on. Is glyphosate getting into our food and water? The measurements are now showing yes. It's water soluble, and there's even farms now in the States that have never used it that are now finding traces of it because of evapotranspiration and rainfall dropping it further over. It's getting into our food, so it's getting into our second brain, that critical microbiome in our guts that drives our entire physiological and immune system. I'm not going to get into the details of what's happening there, but there's two key pathways. It's interfering with the amino acid production line integral to our immune system, chopping that off, making us more vulnerable, and it's crossing our key protective barriers like our gut lining, blood-brain barrier, and even placental membranes. Okay, it's enough of the bad news, because there's a huge amount of good news which we're going to hear about. So what I'm saying is, regenerative agriculture, we now know we can graze, crop, farm, have agroforestry, etc., without chemicals and aggression. It's doable. It's doable incredibly profitably. And just by using regenerative methods and biological inputs. So we can heal the planet and people at the same time, and that's what I'd like to walk you through now. So the solution's the good news. The first step to do that is we've got to gain ecological literacy. We've got to understand how landscapes function, because I certainly didn't when I started farming. Because the current industrial paradigm is really that nature's the enemy. We've got to dominate, control, simplify it so we can then manipulate. And the downside is these escalating costs. And because of that mechanical approach, it precludes having ecological literacy. And so, as I said, when I decided to put the stories together in my book, talking to all these wonderful farmers and then doing a PhD examining the ecology and stuff, where I come from, I'm still attached at ANU, which is an environmental social institute, the Fenner School. Every document's full of the word sustainable, and it's been a great word. But to me, sustaining what? More marking time, I believe. We've now moved into a new phase, open-ended, ongoing improvement, which is the word regeneration. And it has moral connotations as well. And if you want to get in behind that, the ecological reason is by stepping back and enabling nature to regenerate, nature will self-organise to an increased state of health. And that's an incredibly important, exciting concept. So that was me. I had to take over the farm at 22. Grew up on a farm, it doesn't mean you know how to manage it. So I asked the best advice. CSIRO, Department of Ag, read lots of stuff, best farmers. And I did great damage as a consequence to my landscape. I ploughed grasslands, used chemical, overgrazed, set stocked. And it was because I was so illiterate, that landscape there, I didn't realise it should have been in hospital in intensive care. It needed healing. If you like, I was dyslexic. I couldn't read that. And the reason is I'd been trained in a certain paradigm. That photo there shows a boundary fence line on our temperate grasslands on the Monero. On the right, set stocking approach, on the left, an ecological approach. I've stood on both sides. It's a barbed wire fence and it's not a comfortable place to stand. But early in my career, I was definitely on the right side, and hopefully I've moved to the left. But it's all about that square foot of real estate. And so how do we get going with ecological literacy? Well, having to teach masters and third-year students and then write a book. I realised there's lots of ways we could go. There's lots of functions in landscape, chemical and physical. Alan Savory's defined a few of them, and lots of other ecologists, but you can simplify them down to these 5. The solar cycle, the water cycle, soil mineral, biodiversity, and the one that people forget, that square foot of real estate. If you look at that diagram, all those are interconnected. So if you damage one, you're going to damage them all. But if you start regenerating one, it'll have flow-on effects. And that's the exciting thing. All interconnected. And this is what underpins our entire civilization. Our fossil fuels, for example, that drive it have come from some of these processes. So I'll just quickly skip through with some examples. We all know the solar energy is the start. Plants grab carbon dioxide, photosynthesize, turn it into sugars, feeds the soil bugs. Plants access nutrients. And if you do it really well, those soil critters will make things like glomalin for long stored carbon. And I see my role as a manager to stack on as many of those solar panels on those plants for as much of the year as I can to kick those sugars in to create the whole process. As this guy's done, Norman Kroon, in the tough country in Karoo in South Africa, who I stayed with, sadly recently died. Now, when he bought that country in the 70s, it was all like the country on the right. It was desert. 400 years of British and Dutch belting of landscape that once had rivers with hippopotami in it. So he started immediately, he's one of Savory's first operators, to start getting his solar panels on the ground, getting the carbon going, and then came all the other cycles. And you can now see on the left how soft that country is, its diversity, and to the extent today that his family now are running more than 3 times what they started with, and profitability equivalent. It's happening in Australia. That photo shows country up near Bowen in northwest Queensland. There's a red arrow on that. That's the same tree as your benchmark in each of those landscapes. This is 10 years of switching to holistic grazing. Previously, there'd been 100 years of overgrazing, too much burning. Country was rock hard. Imagine a big subtropical rain would all pour off that country. So I started to turn that around. The bottom left-hand photo, before they started, was a steep-sided, actively eroding gully. Now the battens are 45 degrees. You can see it recovering. And Garland, who sent me these photos, told me recently that gully now has about 40 or 50 eucalypt seedlings coming up in it as well. So that's 10 years in some pretty tough country. And I could show you lots of photos. It's doable, it's exciting, and it's all about kicking those landscape processes. And the same in the innovative croppers. The guy on the left, we've got a bush ranger in the room today who's going to be talking later, but what Colin did with pasture cropping, Bruce Maynard and others, is essentially the same. Through whatever reason, starting to maximise those solar panels by using winter dormant seafoil grasses in the cropping cycle, and you can see top left, just as harvesting there a 3-tonne oat crop with no inputs, all that green starting to come as that red grass wakes up. That's compared to the middle photo, which is traditional cropping, a lot of bare ground at different phases, particularly after harvest, instead of the green solar panels working. Now this diagram's taken from the States and the prairies. That's the importance of a range of diversity of plants, forbs, annuals, perennials. Okay, deep soils over there, they go deep. And different functions, microbially, etc. as well, the importance of diversity there. But that orange line I've drawn is what's now emerging widespread in the industrial croplands of the world, in Australia. Because of the annual concentration of grasses and the lack of diversity, there's this hard pan right across. There's nothing going deep, no nutrients coming up, no function for water, etc. And that's now exacerbating at a great rate. Soil mineral cycle. I skipped the water cycle. Sorry. This is a photo in Mexico. That blue arrow, same point in that landscape. And why is the water in that left photo? Because that country above, just like that Bowen country, overgrazed, rock hard, the water runs off and that's after 28 years on the right. No water visible, but probably 10,000 times more in ground, just because of turning those functions. Carbon in the ground, getting the whole soil absorbency going, diversity, etc., etc. Function number 3, which we're already covering in this whole process, because they're all interrelated, is your healthy soil biology. That's an Australian version I got done of Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web. All those critters play a key role, and we'll touch on mycorrhizal fungi directly, but I sat through 2 university courses in soil science 40 years apart, and each time the main focus was chemistry and physics. This is the gold mine. This is where it happens. We need the others, but let's not ignore the key guys. Key fellas like these, the root fungus, the mycorrhizal fungi, and their micro-feeding tubes, which I'll touch on briefly. How have we treated our soils? Not too well. I remember as a young undergraduate climbing in New Zealand, walking on red ice. That was the millions of tonnes of soil from the 30s that had blown up to 4,000 kilometres across to New Zealand, out of pastoral country, South Australia, Broken Hill, Mallee and Wimmera. That's happened on 5 occasions. Millions of tonnes. The All Blacks don't give us any truck playing football. Why the hell should we give them our scarce nutrients when they've got a lot more than we have? Sad, not funny. Still happening. In 2011, I cut through the upper reaches of the Liverpool Plains, some of our best soils. Dry season, 8 mils of rain the night before. There's water still lying there, 12 hours later. I hopped over the fence. Crusted, dead, no structure. They've been so overploughed, so over-fertilised, so over-sprayed that water that should have gone in 10 minutes, still there 12 hours later. And talking to Cole Sykes last night, he's witnessed rock-hard, brick-like things which he thinks it's down to the subsoil. And when I went for a drive later that day, up the top end of the plains, on a public road, there were cattle grids a metre above the soil. We've got to treasure our good stuff. We haven't got much of it. And people like this, a radical development in broadacre cropping as well as the other ones that I've just indicated. The Haggertys with natural intelligence agriculture. This is not Mickey Mouse stuff. They've grown from 1,600 to 16,000 hectares, making profits while most of Western Australian croplands have gone into debt. He won't hop in a tractor unless he's doing 120 hectares a day. They've switched totally from industrial inputs to biological. And I hope Cole might touch on it recently. He's just been over there. But the recent indications are that now that they're refining the system, they had a 3-tonne barley crop the other day compared to the neighbours' industrial crop of 1.5 tonne. And their inputs were a 1/6 of the cost. It's doable. And they're using sheep in holistic grazing as Cole developed with pasture cropping to stimulate the biology and the ecology, and adding another enterprise, by the way, at the same time. Don't know if you can see it, but that's a fence line comparison 2015 post-harvest. So Haggertys on the right, because they're natives, and other green material is now evolving as the weeds disappear under their biological system. That's the traditional neighbour on the left. That's post-harvest. So there's a sand blow into their paddock. And that's their water container. They just took photos 40 metres either side of that fence line. That's post-harvest, basically sand soil in that northeast country in Western Australia that's now going to sit in front of the sun for about 5 or 6 months, cooking the bugs. And that's their same country 40 metres away below. The neighbour's paddock. That windmill photo is actually taken earlier this year. A lot of that sand wheat country sits for 6 months baking in the sun. But that microscopic photo by a colleague of ours, Phil Lee, shows root hairs, but bugger all anything else. If you then look at Haggertys, you can't see the root hairs because it's covered in sticky aggregates and mycorrhizal fungal hyphae, etc., etc. It's chalk and cheese. And this is a photo from Gabe Brown up the top end of the prairies, using biological grazing and multi-species cropping, etc. That's his soil underneath. You can see the aggregate structure and the worms. And that's his neighbour, traditional, just across the fence line on top. Now, if you put a penetrometer into that, you're probably looking at about 200 psi for Gabes, and you break the penetrometer at over 1,000, I reckon, on the neighbour. So it's just that switch of mind to using ecological function. And the numbers are now stacking up. We now know that if we can put just 1% more carbon into our soils, those soils are capable of holding over 400,000 extra litres of water per hectare. That's in the driest continent on Earth. No, sorry, I've got the numbers wrong because I've got my glasses wrong. Over 140,000 extra litres of water per hectare, which is extraordinarily significant in our climate. And the fourth function, whatever you want to call it, but biodiversity, retaining your biodiversity, the co-evolved vegetation from the past for insect, bird predation, etc., animal shelter. It's fundamental. We've destroyed most of it. There's an extraordinary group of farmers west of Melbourne, the Otway Agroforestry Network. Wonderful social learning example, driven by farmers for farmers. And this is one of their leaders, Andrew Stewart and family. That photo on the left was 94. They'd got down to 2% of vegetation in what was pretty well forested country, white settlement. They had to do something because they had salt, deep gullies. They've now gone to 20%. That strainer post, by the way, is the same benchmark in each photo. Then they've increased production despite losing 18% of land, but they've stacked in another 6 or 7 enterprises, both from forestry, ecotourism, bush tucker, cut flowers, that sort of thing. So their social, environmental and economic resilience has gone up. And there's plenty of other examples. Richard Weatherly, one of the pioneers of direct seeding of native plant seeds, took over 4,000 acres of absolutely cleared country, Western Victoria. He's now got tens of kilometres of self-seeded tree breaks, unpaid pest collection by your straw-necked ibis, and he's now got over 240 bird species that have come back in on these riparian and bush areas. So it's exciting what can be done. And I won't belabour it, but if we start thinking vertically instead of just horizontally like I did all my life and bring back our shrubs full of those tens of thousands of phytochemicals, let our domestic animals with their ancient wisdom self-medicate and self-nutrient, which they can detect when they're lacking, it opens whole new ball games. And things like tree lucerne with the high, both being legumes but also high protein levels, is transforming lots of farming operations. And we can't teach the Spaniards or the Portuguese about it. They've been doing it for centuries on their oak landscapes. So, the second component of what regenerative ag can do is how we can address the Anthropocene, which I've already been talking about, but let's look at some of the numbers. And this touches on that fifth function, that square foot of real estate, because it all comes back to our worldview on how we're going to approach things. Without belabouring the point, we need to step across if we can, if we're going to address the Anthropocene. And I won't get into it, but one of the things I learned at going back to uni after 40 years is that if we enable healthy functions to get going and they're part of a complex adaptive system, nature has inherent solutions within called emergent properties to start healing that landscape. Not to say it'll get back to 1788, but it will start to function a lot better and a lot healthier. And that's really what I see my role as a manager now, is to step back and enable nature to get on with it. And it's an exciting concept. We're hearing a lot about the Great Barrier Reef. If you look at the two big catchments, the Burdekin and the Fitzroy, the holistic grazers there now have no nutrient runoff. Your leading cane farmers and croppers have now no nutrient runoff through switching methods to biology, etc. Regenerative agriculture can save the reef nutrient issue overnight if we had the will and the power politically, etc. It's all doable. And this guy is one of the world's leading social and environmental thinkers, Paul Hawkins. Recently got sick of asking climate scientists, what do we do about it? And they said, I don't know, we're just crunching the numbers. So 15 years ago, he got 70 of the world's some of the world's leading thinkers and analysts to look at the 100 best methods of pulling carbon dioxide back down. He published this beautiful book last year. And 80 of those methods are fully costed. And I've got to know Paul and working with him, and I said, look, there's 7 or 8 regenerative methods in there. They're all doing the same thing. Let's call them regenerative agriculture. Let's look at the numbers now. The numbers will tell you that nearly 2.5 times, 240% better than the next method, regenerative agriculture, is number one at pulling down carbon and permanently burying it. That's the importance of regenerative ag. We can address one of the number one climate, Anthropocene, disturbance factors. And the final thing I want to touch on is how regenerative agriculture is now and can impact on human health. And I'm preaching revolution because I'm calling this an underground insurgency. My previous book was on the politically caused destruction of the Australian wool industry, the collapse of the floor price scheme. I don't believe the solutions are going to come from the top. Initially, they've got to come from the bottom, which will then force change at the policy level. And it's going to come from we farmers and the people, our urban consumers, and those now getting into the urban food movement, of which there's a few here today. Yeah, it's a revolution. It's us that's going to change, bottom up, underground revolution. And there's lots of wonderful things happening around Australia already, whether it's the Great Southern Food Community in Western Australia, Food Connect in Brisbane, etc., or your local farmers markets. I've noticed some signs downtown on organics. I dropped in yesterday on Erica and Hayden with their Epicurean harvest. They're doing wonderful stuff only just up the road. So it's happening, and it's got to be a partnership between us delivering healthier food and what's happening in the urban areas. And these are some of the guys that are going to do it. Your root fungus, your mycorrhizal fungus in a healthy soil. Because their partnership with plants in a healthy soil, they get the root sugars, and their part of the bargain is to go off and source the nutrients with their microtubes. And in a healthy cubic metre of soil, there might be 25,000 kilometres of these microtubes working away. We go and plough, spray, fertilise, kill off most of that capacity. And you end up with your drug addict crops or pastures waiting for their dose of a few simple nutrients like NPK, etc. We've missed out on the 99% of the huge variety of nutrients that biology will source for it. And the other component is the younger generation. It's increasingly being divorced from nature. How are we going to become more organic in mind if our 10-year-old kids, the latest surveys show, for every hour of outdoor play, 7 or 8 hours in front of a screen? 6-year-olds and under, only 1 in 4 have ever climbed a tree or a rock. You know, these are worrying issues, and if we're going to get them starting to think organically, we have to work at that level. There's great stuff happening in the cities, which is the other area that, as I say, the partnership has to be with us in the new food movement and greening, etc. So look, I'll wrap up there. And I'll wrap up with this. Dramatic, and some of you have seen it, but literally, as a species, as a planet, we are literally on the edge. I'm not exaggerating. Where I'm at the Fenner School of Environment and Society, some of the world leaders in climate and earth systems, every time they come back from overseas, they're more depressed. And the evidence is mounting, and when you get 98% plus of scientists all saying the same thing across the whole spectrum of these earth systems, you've got to start listening. And as Gus Speth, the leading environmental writer, says, today's problems won't be solved with today's mind. Whereas I was classing sheep the other day, and as the farmer said, yeah, the thinking that got us in the shit won't get us out of it. We have to change our mindscapes before we're going to change our landscapes.
Okay.
And I'm arguing very powerfully. 2 minutes?
Yep.
Only a few to go. Not putting the pressure on. Agriculture, I'm saying, will be front and centre to our futures. Yeah, we're part of the problem, but by heaven, and I think the evidence of what we're seeing here today, and a lot of us are seeing around Australia, we're going to be a key part of the solution. And that's going to be enabling landscape processes to self-organise back to health. And a wonderful American historian, Donald Worcester, environmental historian, had this to say: 3 principles for good farming: making people healthier, promoting a just society, and preserving the earth and its network of life. If we make this shift, I believe we can help save the planet. And to do that, we're going to have to combine, as Lunig has beautifully summarised here, we're going to have to combine the best of that mechanical, scientific mind, the best of that work, with that organic mind that sees ourselves as indivisible from Earth. That shift has to occur if we're going to change. And so I'll put in front of you a new law, if you like, the law of the turtle. Behold the turtle, he makes progress only when he sticks his neck out. And that's what we've got to do. So I'll finish with this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the guy that Hitler had deliberately executed second last day of the war. Because I'm saying we need a new story for our times. And that's because this story of growth and greed is failing us and failing the planet. And Bonhoeffer said this: the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. And I think that's what lies before us. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
There we go. That's a rousing applause. Now listen, I wanted you to stay here because this is a model of how Slido works and the day can work for us. Right. So anyone who's been using the app, there's 90 of you who've logged on, which is great. You'll see, if you look at your questions now, they've been ranked, and this allows me to ask you what the audience have wanted to ask you. So my first question is, some people argue we should get rid of sheep and cattle due to their methane emissions. What do we know about the net emissions change with regen ag? By the way, we only have 4 minutes. So
okay. So all the easy questions, eh?
All the easy questions, yeah, just straight up front.
Well, the first thing is there's no way we're going to regenerate the vast majority of the degraded grasslands and other lands across the earth without holistic grazing of animals. It's the only way you're going to do it. That's point one. And this might be unpalatable. I'm increasingly believing that what Michael Pollan calls concentrated animal feedlots, with all the negatives of health, pharmaceuticals, hormones, animal cruelty, they will eventually have to go, and that's a major source of methane emissions. And if you think about the vast herds of grazing animals in Africa, etc., there are methane always there. It's a furphy by some of the extreme vegans to say that we don't need meat, but we absolutely need healthy meat and vast grazing herds to regenerate our broad landscapes. So.
Okay, second question. Second most popular, here we go, 8 votes. Why aren't the neighbours copying the better results over the fence?
I did a whole PhD thesis on that, and we haven't got time. I remember a lot of the leading innovators, some of whom are here, will tell you that the neighbours rarely ask what you're doing. It's that paradigm thing. And Alan Savory often talks about the 100-mile barrier. It's a lot easier for someone out of a district to come in, pinch some ideas and be seen to be an innovator than the neighbours to change and then have to go to the pub or the footy and say, I'm shifting, I've been a failure all my working life. It's a very complex psychological thing, but it's to do with that paradigm. And just to cement how strong our paradigms are, in those 80 people I interviewed, in 60% of the cases, the leading innovators had changed because of a major life shock. It cracked open the mind, whether it was like coal or fire or whatever, no money. A lot of them had poisoning accidents, marriage breakup, the 80s drought and the millennium drought were head crackers, that sort of thing.
You might be able to answer this one with a single syllable. Is glyphosate any worse than the plough?
Oh, gee, good question. Look, they're both of a similar ilk. I'm not going to compare them, I don't think.
Okay. What do we got here? What support do farmers need to make this shift?
Well, I think what's exciting about what we're seeing in this room and what's evolving in Australia, we have a number of the grazing groups, whether it's RCS or HM, Otway Agroforestry, your biological farmers. There are some very sophisticated social learning support networks. And interesting, a lot of us that are doing a lot of talks, Landcare is the key organiser still in getting groups like this together. Mm-hmm. And I think you can't force change, but you just have to keep presenting the examples and the information, and that's going to encourage this gradual shift. I think we're still in the early adoption phase. We haven't sort of got the takeoff, but it's starting to move through the early adoption phase and innovation cycle.
We'll hear a bit from Dr. Jackie Shermer later on that, which relates to what you're saying. Okay, isn't this great? We get to go through lots of questions.
I don't know.
Good,
Depends which side
you're on the
you're
spot. Bruce Watt asks, please explain your approach to dealing with increasing soil acidity on the central tablelands.
Look, I'm no expert on the central tablelands, but I think the overall lesson of anyone working in soil biology is that nature has an extraordinary capacity to self-correct issues rather than trying to put in doctored solutions like overdoses of lime and stuff. So it's probably mix and match, but I think left to her own, once you regenerate function, it looks like nature has a great capacity to self-heal.
Sometimes we've just got to get out of the way, eh?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well look, can we have another round of applause? A big thank you to Charles Massey.